another YouTube channel called Smarter Every Day featuring Destin Sandlin, an aerospace engineer, missile technologist, veteran, and PhD student, released a video on December 3rd, 2023 outlining issues with the Starship HLS Artemis paradigm and the larger implications of it. For this video, he was a keynote speaker at the October 2023 Von Braun Space Exploration Symposium titled Advancing Space from LEO to Lunar and Beyond. Since the current NASA framework for these goals is Artemis, and Destin had some concerns about the program, he decided that out of concern for this mission, he needed to relay some hard truths to the people in the room, specifically about the mission architecture of Artemis 3, and the failure of people to speak up when tough questions are asked, even when lives hang in the balance.
The more I started digging into Artemis, the more I realized there might be some issues in how people communicate about it. Like there's some architecture problems. This is the truth, and this is what needs to be said. And NASA, please don't hate me.
The first time we came across Destin's channel was in the very beginning of our channel. His episode Touring ULA with Tori Bruno, released on February 29th, 2020, called How Rockets Are Made. If you want to watch a walkthrough video of a proper rocket factory hosted by an aerospace engineer who is having a great conversation with a verbally competent CEO who knows how every machine in this factory works, this is the video for you. Great channel if you haven't found it yet. Easy to see why he's got 11 million subs. Guy knows what he's talking about, and he is not afraid to say the hard truth that needs to be said, which is one more reason for us to like the guy. As an extra bonus, his grandfather was an engineer for the Apollo program, so not only did he grow up in this environment, he can provide some historical context. Destin's hour-long keynote speech to this crowd was a funny, informative, and grounded take on the current Artemis program, with special emphasis on the differences between the Starship HLS paradigm compared to the Apollo-era missions. We've cut the hour-long talk down to a matter of minutes while trying to hit all the high points, but please go to his channel later and check out the presentation in full. For now, here are the thoughts he had that we think need to be discussed at all levels of NASA right now, and as he goes along, we'll slip in some comments along the way. Right out of the gate, he's going to address what he already knows is an issue with communication in this room, and he wastes no time breaking that ice.
So my assumption here is that I'm talking to a room full of policymakers, intelligent people that are going to shape the future of human spaceflight. Is that correct? Somebody talk to me. Engineers, program managers, we as a society have lost the ability to provide negative feedback to each other. Because why? So this is the thing. You're terrified to talk right now, and that's a problem. You know the truth, and you're afraid to say it. Young engineers on the front row, what is this? PID control loop. What's an important part of the PID control loop? Feedback. Feedback is important to any engineer. If you have only positive feedback in the system, what happens to it? It goes unstable and chaotic, and things explode and break, and it's bad.
So Destin has already determined the people in this room are timid when asked a simple question, and he's going to show them why that's an issue as the talk goes on. But if it's this bad at NASA, you can only imagine what it would be like at SpaceX, where Musk fires anybody who questions him or his instructions, a behavior he's famous for throughout the companies that he is supposed to lead. How can an environment of pure intimidation possibly result in a team effort that will build the system they need to conduct this mission, especially when the people who are bright enough to see the issues are then summarily escorted out of the building?
We're going, right? I've seen the video. We are going. But there's this thing. There's a scoreboard that exists, and the scoreboard looks like this. Apollo era engineers, 6 lunar landings. Artemis, 0. So they did it, right? Let's look at how they did it. So this is the mission for Apollo. Left Earth, went out to LLO, went down, ascent stage, come back up, some rendezvous action in there, come home, right? Here's Artemis 3. Let's look at this. Remember the part about saying the truth earlier? What do you guys think about this? It's different. Why is it different? So then I started trying to understand the architecture to get there. To get the human lander to the moon, we have to launch a bunch of additional rockets to tank up in low Earth orbit. I didn't know that. And I'm like, well, how many rockets do we have to do that with? And they're like, 6. Dude, really, how many rockets is it? Some people are like, well, it's looking like 8. We have to fire 8 rockets to fire 1 rocket to the moon? I mean, that's what they're saying, but it's probably more like 12. You know, I'm an engineer. I know how to do this stuff. So I started to account for nominal schedule slip and boil off, and this is how many rockets it's going to take to fuel up that thing to get it to the moon. So the question is this smart? And now's the time where people are scared to talk again. Not efficient. It's not efficient. I picked a picture from the We Are Going video. That's how many rockets went to the moon and landed for all of Apollo. And I'll take you back to this chart. Okay, I've said enough.
People in the audience did not know the number of rockets that were going to be used to refuel the lander. That's a problem. When I said 12 rockets the way I did, they laughed.
It's probably more like 12.
People didn't know the answer to this question. This is indicative of a communication problem. The fact that we have this very complex architecture and we don't know the exact answer to such a big question is pretty damning, because if we don't know such a simple answer to a big question, what does that say about the little things?
Destin is absolutely right here. How can NASA even begin to start working out a mission architecture or timetable when they don't know how many tanker launches it's going to take? If you don't know how many launches you need, you can't have any concept as to how long the vehicle will be loitering in orbit, what boil-off will be, what supplies are going to be required for any crew that may be aboard. What if the refilling process takes weeks or months longer to conduct? What's the contingency plan if one or more of the ships doesn't make it to orbit? What additional logistics are then involved? Nobody knows these answers because they can't know these answers until this critical number is finalized. This is indicative of a horrible lack of communication between the contractor, SpaceX, and the client, NASA. And it's an issue plaguing Jim Free right now, who is getting no answers from SpaceX with regards to realization of benchmarks.
SpaceX is on contract to do an uncrewed lander. Our milestone before that is the ship-to-ship cryogenic propellant transfer. We're delaying our CDR until they complete that. Then they have to just get flying. That's a lot of launches to get those missions done. We have a firm fixed price contract with SpaceX. Their job is to deliver that to us, and I'm going to hold them accountable to it. So they need to get flying before we can get any kind of assessment. If you figure they need a number of launches to do their depot for our crewed flight, they need a number of launches to do the demo, they need a number of launches just to get flying, they have a significant number of launches to go. That, of course, gives me concern about the December of 2025 date.
Does that sound like NASA is being fully apprised of every action being taken by SpaceX to achieve their goal? Or does it sound like NASA is operating on a wing and a prayer right now, hoping that SpaceX can hit any of these milestones in the near future? After the second Starship launch disaster, Jim Free put out this tweet, which, if you read the context here, is basically asking SpaceX, what did you learn from this launch that will help you move forward? Since the vehicle didn't make orbit, no booster recovery was attempted, and the mission failed twice due to LOV. We can tell you one thing that they did learn from that launch. They learned that it can take their telemetry technicians over 3 minutes to realize the ship has exploded and is tumbling through the sky over Key West. In light of these failed launches, Jim's only recourse now seems to be withholding future payments until the propellant transfer demo is completed successfully. But that's really not much of a penalty at the end of the day, because SpaceX, as we found out, had already collected billions towards this contract before Kathy Leaders ever left NASA. Going back to the Smarter Everyday video, Destin now launches into an Apollo flashback from his grandfather's time around NASA for a direct comparison.
When my grandfather was sipping coffee out of this mug down the road, they had quarterly reports on every little component of what was going on, down to the pressure transducers at some subcontractor at a small plant somewhere in America. They knew what was going to happen, because the more complex a system is, the more communication you need to make it work.
Saturn V Quarterly Film Report number 7.
Saturn V Quarterly Film Report number 9.
We are 2 years out from this launch, and we don't know the number of rockets. It's time to be honest. It is time to lay out and systematize the communication so that every organization that's involved knows far more information than they need, and we have actual targets and dates that are actionable, and they don't depend on a miracle in technological innovation occurring at some point on the Gantt chart. We actually have actionable things that have to happen in certain timeframes, and if something doesn't happen, a critical technology isn't developed, we communicate that there's a schedule slip to everyone. The fact that it still says 2 years till this launch tells me that we have a communication issue, and I would like for that to be resolved by centralized leadership. There, I said my thing.
Now, to update this information, since the release of his video, the GAO and NASA realized in December that 2 years out is not a feasible time frame. Maybe this dressing down from Destin in October of 2023 played a part in that, and hopefully this next segment hit home for the people in the room as well.
If I'm not mistaken, this room is full of people that are industry leaders that are in charge of taking humans back to the moon. Answer the following question. Have I read NASA SP-287? And if you have not read it, shame on you. You have a whole generation of engineers that did the coolest thing engineering humans have ever done, and they gave you the playbook. And they're like, hey, this is how you do it. This is the key. It's a lot of really good stuff, but let's just read some of them. Of course, the way we got this job done was with meetings. Big meetings, little meetings, hundreds of meetings. The thing we always tried to do in these meetings was to encourage everyone, no matter how shy, to speak out, hopefully, but not always, without being subjected to ridicule. We wanted to make sure we had not overlooked any legitimate input. Seems like they might have had a little different culture.
In a room full of experts and engineers, Destin is reminding them the only stupid question is the question never asked, and that when the first moon landing program was being developed, every question was encouraged. And that's how they wound up creating a system that not only worked, but was also loaded with redundancies and contingency plans, which is why when the Apollo engineers were building their craft, their motto was keep it simple.
All right, so spacecraft design, I thought this was interesting. This is the key to how to build your spacecraft. Build it simple and then double up on as many components or systems so that if one fails, the other will take over. Examples are ablative thrust chambers that don't require regenerative cooling, hypergolic propellants that don't require ignition source. I was kind of blown away to learn that the ascent stage in the current design does not use hypergolic propellants. That blew my mind. So we're going up there, we gotta ignite this. I get it, you wanna use in situ and you wanna do methane, I got it, but hypergols always work. You make them touch and they go boom, that's how it works. Why are we introducing complexity into a system? Then I looked at Artemis 3. In order for this to work, it starts, humans have never done cryogenic refueling in orbit up to this point right now. And I think it's important for you guys to talk about this with authority because you're smart and you know things. We should make it as simple as possible.
Destin is now making direct comparisons of the complexity of Artemis against the simplicity of Apollo. The hypergolic propellants versus the methane rockets SpaceX intends to use reflects a chasm of design philosophy between the two designs. And Destin is about to get into another example of how much thought went into the Apollo craft and the situations it might encounter.
Have you ever looked at how they decided to get the lunar lander off the moon, the ascent stage? It's crazy because it's awesome. So we're gonna get the timing right, we're gonna launch. That doesn't work because things aren't whatevering. Here's what we're gonna do. If all else fails, open the hatch, go around the back. And so there's these guillotines that connect the descent and the ascent stage. And you had to flip a switch and it would cut the guillotines, right? If that didn't work for whatever reason, you're gonna get out of the spacecraft, you're gonna go to the bottom of the spacecraft with bolt cutters, and you're going to cut the straps that are holding the ascent and the descent stage together. They had redundancy after redundancy after redundancy after redundancy, all the way down to the bolt cutters, and Harrison Schmitt said there was one thing after this. I just wanna know what that was. Are we building that level of redundancy into today's systems? Go look at the documents. This is a real thing. All right, so.
Of course, every engineer in the room knows for a fact that the level of simplicity and redundancy attained by their predecessors is not represented in the image of Starship sitting on a landing pad that magically appeared at Moon Base Alpha, which apparently is an actual diagram in the SpaceX filings. And speaking of landing pads, that takes us to one of the most critical redundancies necessary in a space vehicle, where in the event something goes wrong, and the crew needs to override the automatic flight plan, that the crew has not only the ability, but also the training required to take over control of the ship. Destin covers this topic as well, but first, we're going to take another excerpt from the NSF interview for how the actual leads at NASA are preparing for this.
The ability to manually take control of the lander. So, you've got the automated guidance system, but we saw what happened with Apollo 11 with Neil Armstrong, right? He's miles off course and has to actually manually control himself around to find a good place to land. What are ways that, they've been able to pivot with that to make sure that they're going to be safe on that HLS system?
So we're still at the stage of development where we're working through those topics. From a requirement standpoint, what we did is we wrote requirements that the lander both has to be fully autonomous, and that the crew has to be able to intervene and take over manual control. As the design gets further along, what we'll end up doing is spending a lot of time with the crew in simulators and going through different manual control algorithms and testing different lighting conditions and environments and vehicle response rates to be able to get to a point where it really is a vehicle that can both be autonomous but able to be operated by the crew in case something takes over.
Okay, so to get the astronauts trained up for landing on the moon in 1/6 gravity, their plan is to run simulation after simulation with different conditions in play. But none of that is up and running yet because they are still in the development stage creating that redundant system. Now listen to what Destin has to say about what crew training should look like, along with a man who helped design the Apollo LLTV, Lunar Landing Training Vehicle, and another man who flew it.
Crew training is paramount. The Lunar Lander Test Vehicle, for example, if you're going to land in a 1/6 G environment, you have to know how to do that. Our pilots are used to walking around in 1G. This is how they trained astronauts to land on the moon. The reason this is more important than a simulator is the astronaut in the seat, their life is on the line. That psychological training has a huge component. Mr. Ottinger, who worked on the control system, and I asked him a very important question.
Do you think something like the LLTV needs to happen to train astronauts to go back to the moon?
They aren't going to go if they don't get a trainer, a free flight trainer, I can tell you that.
Really?
Yeah, they won't go without it.
I hope that the person at the controls has a simulation experience that is at least as good as the LLTV provided the Apollo crews a half century later. Thank you.
After showing his audience in no uncertain terms the difference between what was then and what is now, in the voice of one of their own from the Apollo era, and a man whose life was saved by the training he went through, Destin is going to remind them again of the primary responsibility an engineer has, regardless of the roadblocks they face.
As the engineers responsible for getting humans to the moon safely and returning them, it is imperative that you provide negative feedback in situations that call for it. If you lose your job for providing negative feedback, good on you. If it needed to be said and nobody said it, that would be the worst thing to live with. Don't compromise on your standards. Let me tell you what's going to happen. You're going to get in that room and you're going to tell them, we can't do this, and we can't do this because of that. And they're going to say, but my schedule, you just have to be willing to say the truth. You mitigate the risk as far as you can. You communicate clearly, but you make sure you don't compromise on standards. It's time to put points on the board, and they've given you the playbook. SP-287, look at the mission differently. Keep it simple, right? In a world of talkers, be a thinker and a doer. Be willing to take action in the meetings, to make the hard decisions, and ask the hard questions. We do not need to have an Apollo 1 type event in order to get us in gear. Don't get fixated on a technology demonstration. Just because we can do something new and sexy and awesome and amazing and wild doesn't mean you have to. Simple is good. And so as long as it accomplishes the mission. So be mission focused, and I think things are going to be okay.
Destin ended off on a gentle note, but the presentation was obviously geared at sending these engineers and department heads home with food for thought about where the program stands and what needs to be done to save it. He also showed them exactly where to find that information. SP-287 is the roadmap to get to the moon. Part of their thought process moving forward will no doubt include the question, how did NASA get sucked into allowing a contractor to change absolutely everything about a system that successfully flew men to the moon decades ago? How did the Keep It Simple motto get tossed out the window? Why is the entire Artemis 3 mission reliant upon untested technology breakthroughs that need to be provided by a company with a part-time CEO who would much rather sit on his phone all day and curse out his social media advertisers in public? And this is the degree to which Keep It Simple has been dismissed as SpaceX fails to deliver for NASA. On February 1st, 2024, NASA published their 2023 annual wrap-up report. Heading number 4, Section B, deals with Artemis progress and challenges. We'll quote it directly in full, the degree to which Artemis concerns the panel that published this document due to the aggressive launch timeline combined with the number of firsts that must be accomplished to achieve Artemis 3 objectives, many of which must be performed sequentially in a fully successful manner, even before its launch. The following is a partial list of the firsts either attempted as a demonstration before the Artemis 3 mission or attempted on the Artemis 3 mission itself. A. First mission dependent on a human landing system requiring approximately 15 fueling launches to support Artemis 3. B. First launch of the new Orion variant. C. First use of the HLS LEO depot station, including cryo refueling. And we're just going to point out that NASA is using the term refueling. So if any muskrat gives you shit for using refueling instead of the term refilling, tell them to pound sand. If you know, you know. D. First HLS launch from Cape Canaveral on a new launch pad. E. First HLS lander Orion rendezvous and docking in lunar orbit. F. First HLS uncrewed lunar landing. G. First HLS uncrewed demonstration of a successful lunar ascent. H. First HLS crewed landing on the moon. I. First lunar extravehicular activity EVA since 1972. J. First use of the new EVA suits. K. First HLS crewed ascent from lunar surface to lunar orbit. L. First use of lunar surface communication and broadly integrated communication system. M. First landing at the challenging South Pole site. These points refer to the Starship HLS. As yet, there is no comparable evaluation of Artemis 5, including the Blue Origin craft. So take all of that into consideration, along with the fact that according to court documents, the original contract that Musk agreed to was supposed to launch for the moon last month, January 2024, with the mission preliminary design review due way back in July of 2022, and the mission critical design review due a year ago. And you get some idea how foobarred Artemis 3 is at this point in time. We said at the time the solo HLS contract was awarded to SpaceX by the same person heading up that program now in Boca Chica that the mistake of awarding Musk that contract was going to cost North Americans the moon, and we have yet to be proven wrong on that prediction. When the strongest critiques exposing the most basic flaws in this program were coming from YouTubers such as CSS and Thunderfoot, then there is a more serious core issue happening at NASA. And Destin nailed it. During the Apollo program, every aspect of the program was managed, scheduled, benchmarked, these smallest details reviewed repeatedly, the steps laid out for all to see. Now, under the private contractor arrangement that NASA has with Musk, they have none of the above. According to his recent public statements, Jim Free has no certainty about any aspect of Starship, not regarding refilling technology, not regarding the demo mission, not even regarding the basics of Starship reliability and safety. Hell, they don't even know where this is going to launch from, and nobody wanted this vehicle anywhere near the infrastructure assets at Kennedy before both IFT-1 and 2 ended in disaster. And Musk's iterative design process for this vehicle is an obvious abject failure. So what does NASA have in Starship compared to what they know worked? They've got a completely different vehicle, made from completely different materials, using completely different engines, using a different propellant mix, using refilling technology that was not required before, and a completely different mission architecture. There are no commonalities between this and what got men to the moon 50 years ago. But thankfully, SpaceX is no longer the only private rocket company with a lunar landing contract. And relying on a completely different mindset at Blue Origin might just get the Artemis program back on track, with a system that more closely mimics the original successful formula. That already has a lander concept fully fleshed out that NASA can walk through and customize. That has a suitable rocket with new, proven engines scheduled to fly later this year to Mars, 5 years ahead of their scheduled lunar duty. And rather than trying to get a 23-story stainless steel cigar tube to land on its butt in loose lunar regolith, Blue Moon will be smaller, squatter, with the astronauts closer to the ground, which can be accessed by ladder. Much more in line with the vehicles NASA used in the past, being built by a company moving forward step by step with intent and ferocity, without false promises promoted by an army of idiots. In fact, Blue Origin moves forward in spite of the muskrats. So there's a chance Blue Origin can get Artemis back on the rails. And if that's the case, where Blue Origin is ready to go before Musk can get his ducks in a row, there's every possibility that Artemis 5 could fly before Artemis 3. And here's why we think so. In August of 2023, NASA had an Artemis Update conference. Now keep in mind this was before the GAO announcement of delays and the 2023 year-end report. The question for Jim Free came from Marcia Dunn of the Associated Press.
What's your working target date for Artemis 3? Is it still late 25?
For Artemis 3,
We're still working to our contractual dates with everyone, which is the December of 25. We did receive a updated schedule from SpaceX that we're looking to get some more detail on. We were at Starbase a couple weeks ago and really spent some time going through their major milestones to the Artemis 3 mission, which includes a prop transfer mission as well as the uncrewed demo. So really kind of sharing our philosophy, their philosophy, where they are with the hardware, trying to understand their schedule some more. So I think we'll look at that and update around that in the near future after we have some time to digest it. But what we're holding all the contractors to is that December of 25 date. We may end up flying a different mission if that's the case. If we're have these big slips out, we've looked at can we do other missions if the possibility exists there.
Given the current state of the Starship program, Jim Free would be remiss, as administrator of this program, to not offer the first Artemis moon landing to the first company past the post. Because at the end of the day, the Tortoise may well be the only private rocket company in the running that can get NASA astronauts back on lunar soil safely. At the time of this conference, Jim Free was hoping to hold Musk to a December 2025 timetable. Well, according to a Musk tweet from February 9th of 2024, Musk is saying he thinks Starship should be able to get to the moon in 5 years. Not 2025, not 2026, not 2027, but bumping up against the Blue Origin timetable for Artemis 5 in 2029. But before we sign off, there's something that's been bugging us all the way along about the paradigm for SpaceX HLS, because it's actually quite illogical, even if the stars align and SpaceX gets it to work as promised. In the con ops for Artemis 3, in theory, the progression is Starship gets to LEO, gets refilled with propellants, shoots off for the moon. It is not carrying personnel at this point. That crew will be launched separately on SLS, traveling to the moon in the Orion capsule. The two craft rendezvous in NRHO, a highly elliptical 3-body orbit with a 1-week interval. Personnel move from Orion to Starship. Starship lands on the moon, stays the intended time, and ascends back to orbit. Another rendezvous in NRHO. Personnel embark Orion and head back to Earth. So then what? The entire premise of Artemis is that the HLS vehicles are reusable, like an elevator to and from the surface to be used over and over again, and acting as the hab while astronauts are on the moon. Well, if this thing is supposed to be getting reused, how is it getting refilled? How is it getting resupplied? How is it getting repaired? If another Orion capsule comes from Earth with a crew, they're going to have to bring all the supplies they need for their mission in the capsule, which makes Starship seem pointless. Why the need for a giant structure to move back and forth from the surface to orbit if everything the astronauts need can fit in the capsule? And can that capsule hold 1,200 tons of propellant to refill the Starship? Guessing not, or it would have to be the size of the Starship tanks. And if Starship is not going to be reused in this manner, the Starship HLS makes even less sense, since it can't return to Earth for reuse because it can't survive a descent through the atmosphere. This really demonstrates how the Starship lander has not been fully thought through. Blue Moon, on the other hand, has a completely different SOP. It too will require refilling, but certainly not 1,200 tons worth of propellant, as the craft is far smaller than Starship. It will be refilled in NRHO, because in the con ops for Artemis 5, there is a cislunar transporter designed by Lockheed Martin that will be refilled in LEO, then shipped off to NRHO to meet the lander before it docks at Gateway, a joint effort between NASA, the Canadian Space Agency, JAXA, and ESA. In NRHO, crew arriving at Gateway in the Orion capsule will transfer into the lander, drop to the surface, do their mission, come back up, then they hop into Orion for their trip back to Earth. But in this case, the lander and the transporter are now ready for another mission. When the lander needs to be resupplied or refilled, there is already a logistical vehicle accounted for in their system for the next mission. This system would appear to be a lot more logical, provided that Blue Origin and their partners can work out their on-orbit refilling system in that time frame, something no company nor agency has managed to pull off yet, and something we've given SpaceX a fair amount of grief about. After all, SpaceX was awarded a $53 million bonus contract in 2020 just to prove their orbital refilling program, and so far they have nothing to show for it. Now, the one thing we don't like is that the original concept lander the national team provided had an ascent stage that would launch from the surface of the moon from the descent stage it left behind. It split in half, just like on Apollo. Two different sets of engines because landing in a loose regolith of the moon is sure to damage the engines firing into it. That's why that feature was incorporated into the original design. But because the requirements of the mission now are for the craft to be completely reusable, like an elevator, the entire craft has to launch as it landed, and that means won't have separated ascent and descent engines. To punctuate that point, Apollo 15 is a historical precedent where a hard landing on the edge of a crater resulted in the descent stage engine bell getting buried in the regolith.
8 feet -1. Contact. Man. Okay, Houston, the Falcon is on the plane at Hadley. No denying that, we had contact.
The craft suffered damage on the underside. Had the ascent stage not been up and out of harm's way, those astronauts would have all died on the moon. So how they're going to mitigate that aspect of the lander will be something to keep an eye on. Being a smaller craft, of course, it should be much easier to kick off the surface than the behemoth Starship, but firing into the regolith each time gives us pause for concern. All things considered, given the progress of the two competitors, the designs they're working on, the concept of operations they're working within, and the respective dedication to the mission from the company CEOs, our money is on the tortoise, making it to the moon first. And if that happens, who's going to have the blue balls then? As we thank you for tuning into this series from the Common Sense Skeptic, we leave you with a highlight reel of Artemis 1, the only vehicles to fly to date in the Artemis program. A perfect mission for SLS and Orion on their very first time out. It's been a marathon and we learned a lot, so hopefully you have as well from this 2-hour production. As much as we covered, there will always be items that can be discussed further, and that's what the comments section is for. Be sure to leave any questions you have that were left unanswered, and maybe we'll do a follow-up to address them. If you would like to directly support future Common Sense Skeptic episodes and multi-part series, you can subscribe to our Patreon, or for a one-time donation, find our GoFundMe page. It also helps the channel a great deal if you give the episode a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Also, make sure you're subscribed and ring that notification bell so that you'll know when the Common Sense Skeptic returns.